Hi, I'm Tonia, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience, a little bit in my history growing up, and I come back around to Melissa here and how our stories interact. So I grew up with a stepfather in a very normal family until I was about 9 years old, 8 years old, around that time, when my parents divorced. And my mother married my biological father. My biological father was someone that was very violent, addicted to drugs, as my mom had been off and on through her life at this point. So when he came back into our lives, things got very violent and very just unrestful and chaotic. And that was the environment I was raised in up to high school. And at one point in high school, I told my mom that I would leave if she didn't leave. I was around drugs and alcohol, and I was allowed to use drugs from a very young age. It didn't matter. It was as long as I went to school and I got decent grades, it didn't matter what I did for the most part. My mom needed to know where I was at, but other than that, I had a lot of freedom. Drugs for me were never... It was fun. I did lots of different kind of drugs, nothing intravenous, but I tried and experimented with a lot of different things. But to me, it was just for fun. So when I met Melissa's father, we were in high school, and I became pregnant at 19. To me, that was the end of it. I stopped using drugs. I didn't drink. Now I thought, okay, I need to grow up. I'm going to be a mom. Well, my boyfriend at the time, Melissa's dad, I didn't realize it, but he was a full-blown addict, and he was using cocaine. And I didn't recognize that until I said, okay, we're having a baby. Now we're done partying. There's no more partying. This is just going to be, we're going to be parents. We're going to be young parents. And he couldn't stop. And then we were on this next 4-year roller coaster of, him getting clean. We went to church and trying to stay clean and trying to recover from that. And I'm trying to raise kids. And, we had my second daughter Amanda. Melissa was 3. And then we had my son 2 years after that. And when I had Josh, my son, I left my husband at that time. I told him he had to move. I drove him to his cousin's house, and that was the last time I ever lived with their father. And I just needed to not be around addicts. Being naive as a parent and such a young parent, I assumed if you didn't raise your kids around alcohol and drugs, and we drink. I have always drank, but not to excess, at least in my mind. And I always felt if you didn't teach your children that in your house, they wouldn't learn it. That would not be a behavior. I was never going to raise my kids the way I was raised. They were never going to be exposed to anything like that. I didn't continue to do drugs. Not to say I didn't experiment throughout my 20s. I did, here and there, different friends. But to me, it was more like, hey, we're having a party tonight and we're going to have fun and snort this cocaine. And then we're done. That was it. It wasn't part of my lifestyle, and that situation didn't come up very often. And so, having kids for me was like, you just let that go and, you be responsible and raise your kids. And I never wanted my children raised in the environment that I was raised. So I worked really hard to just make money. I didn't have a college degree. I had a high school degree, and then got into business and, just became a working parent. And I spent so much time focusing on working. And then, of course, having a relationship with somebody that I fell in love with, and him learning about my children and getting to know my kids and loving my kids like I loved my kids, and, getting married and having a normal, quote unquote normal, home life for my kids, and a house that they can live in. And we didn't have a lot of money, but I worked really hard, worked a lot of hours. I started traveling. He worked, and trying to raise my children to see that this is what a normal lifestyle is. When I first realized that my daughter was using drugs, She was probably 14 or 15 by the time I realized it. What I didn't know was that she'd probably been using drugs, Melissa, for about 2 years. And I know you'll talk about your story, but up to that point, I was such a naive mom in the sense I thought that if I didn't raise her around it, if I didn't show my kids this lifestyle, that it wouldn't be a part of our life. That's just how naive I was. And I certainly wasn't looking for it around her age at 13. So my younger daughter Amanda went through a very traumatic family experience where it devastated our entire family, and I put part of my ignorance of the situation and what was happening with Melissa down to the fact that this family tragedy that took place that affected my younger daughter and my niece just took everything else became oblivious for me. I couldn't not in that moment, everything else just kind of went away. And Melissa, when that was happening, was probably 11. And that was, I'm sorry, she was such a good girl, and so, so beautiful and focused on her friends and what I perceived to be doing very well and a happy kid. So I wasn't paying attention, and my focus went to what was happening with my other daughter, and it was devastating. The situation was devastating to our entire family. It shook our very foundation as a family as a whole, our extended family, our immediate family. It affected all of us. And as a mom, it was to the point that I could almost not cope. And what happened in my mind when I look back at that now, I feel like all I could do was drink heavily for a while, try to keep my younger daughter from killing herself and keep her in counseling, and try to help my niece and my sister. And I wasn't paying attention. And I learned that was the worst thing I've ever done, is not pay attention to what was happening with my older daughter. I will regret that my entire life. Biggest mistake I made, for sure. So when I did lift my head up and pay attention to my daughter, she had become 13. She was beautiful. I mean, look at her. She's beautiful. Dark hair. She's so Latin and looking, I'm the white mama, but this is my Latin Puerto Rican daughter who's amazing and beautiful. And, I didn't realize that Melissa was going through her own challenges. She looks very Hispanic. We lived in a Hispanic community, a lower income area at the time, and her friends were pretty much the Hispanic community, but she didn't speak Spanish. She's Puerto Rican. She looks Latin, not like the rest of us, but she couldn't speak the language. So Melissa, later on in life, I learned that, she had a tough time through grade school and trying to find where she fit. And Melissa was always very, you were always a very insecure child. Mm-hmm. So I know that you struggled with your identity and where you fit with that.
And I ended up with Asian friends.
She did. So the Asian community actually accepted my daughter. And unfortunately, the Asian community was also new as far as typically speaking. Her friends were first generation Americans in this country, which meant none of the parents spoke English. So by the time I came out of my fog of what was happening with my younger child and our entire family, Melissa was well on her way to using drugs, being exposed to it through the Asian community. And I had no idea what was going on. All I knew is I'm trying to keep a track of my 13-year-old kid and now 14-year-old kid, and she is out of control. I can't talk to the parents because none of them speak English. All her friends are coming from Vietnam.
No.
Or Laos. Cambodia. Other countries. So none of the parents being, new to the United States, they didn't understand what their children were being exposed to, and they had far too much freedom. And so now that I pull my head out of my ass, basically, I'm trying to get control over an out of control teenager that has been using drugs for 1.5 to 2 years, that I was unaware of. And she's addicted at this point, which took me another probably good year to actually come to terms that she's addicted. And I think the moment for me that I really realized this is Melissa was in her room and, I'm trying to ground her. I'm trying to keep track of what's going on. I've got a full-time career. I'm traveling in and out of the country. My husband at the time, her stepdad, was doing his best to try to control the situation, but we were young parents. Realized just how bad things were with Melissa until I'm sitting in a room one day and we're arguing. We're having this fight. Her room is a disaster. I can't get her to clean it. She's arguing with me all the time. I'm trying to get control of her. She's pretty much out of control as far as like trying to sneak out of the house, not behaving. I know she's doing drugs, but because I was a child who grew up doing drugs and never felt out of control or that I had to do drugs, I didn't really get the concept of addiction just yet. To me, you made a choice. Just say no worked perfectly for me. That was how naive it was. And so I'm sitting in Melissa's room and I'm trying to get a handle on the situation and we're screaming at each other, and then she sits down on her bed and she literally starts pulling clumps of her hair out of her head. And I almost fainted because I look at her and I'm like, Melissa, this is not normal. Look at your hands. And she has these clumps of hair in her hands. And I realized at that moment I've lost complete control. I don't know what to do. I don't know what to say. I'm watching my child destroy herself and I don't know how to help her. And it was absolutely terrifying. And that was the moment I realized that everything is out of control. I have lost a grip. I'm sitting there in my head and I'm trying to determine what the hell do I do now? My daughter clearly has a problem. I am not prepared. I've never been talked to about this. I've not experienced it myself. I didn't understand that she just couldn't say no, but at this point it feels very much a mental problem. This doesn't look normal in any way, not her behavior. She couldn't even tell she was pulling her hair out. She was just so gone. And so I knew counseling had to happen. I've always been super open to that kind of thing. And so I contacted, through her insurance, and I got her into a counselor initially. And we started going to counseling, but she wasn't really feeling it. I mean, she did not really get into it yet. And part of that, maybe she didn't connect with it. It might have not been the right person. We probably went 2 or 3 times. We really didn't start getting into counseling that was any kind of affected until she started going to treatment, and that's much further down the story. Mm-hmm. So, I did stupid things. I went to school with her to try to make her go to school. Do you remember the day I went to school with you?
I would just go for both of the lunches. So I went to school just to eat lunch. We left. We went back for the second lunch, and then we left again. We weren't going at all.
I tried to talk to parents. I tried to let her and all her friends hang out at my house so I could see what they're doing and keep an eye on what they're doing. None of the parents spoke English. She had Mexican friends or she had Asian friends. Literally none of the parents spoke English. So all I could do is talk to her friends, which is why I let so many people hang out at my house. That in and of itself was a mistake. I had some things missing and things broken. Mostly my music was gone. Mm-hmm. My CDs, they stole those left and right.
I had some good friends that were into drugs that did hang out there though. But then there was some other ones that came over when you weren't home. But
yes. And so the ones that were there when I was there, typically speaking, were I always thought kids, my philosophy was always kids are good. Society, we as parents and people ruin them at some point. Mm-hmm. So I didn't mind that they were at the house. I wanted to see them. Even I didn't realize some of these people were gang members at the time. I hadn't realized that Melissa really was getting involved in gang activity. I was such a naive mom. And at this point, really, Melissa's story, she should start picking up with her story. But one of the things I will say in retrospect, when I look back on that time, I was a young mom with no college degree that was working so hard to have a career and show my daughters that you can be strong women, and no matter what your background, you can come out ahead, you can make money, you can have a profession. You don't, just because this job requires a degree doesn't mean you have to have one to get there. I've done all those things, but in hindsight, it really became a matter of, I feel like I sacrificed my kids to do that. Even though their stepdad was there helping take care of them. And, you know, we were both so young, we didn't know what we were doing half the time. He certainly didn't, but we did our best. Wasn't good enough. It certainly was not in my mind in any way. Things would be done differently. Obviously, you grow older and you realize some of those mistakes you made, and things you would do differently. But I tried to be the mom that didn't raise my kids the way I was raised, so that they wouldn't be exposed to those things. And instead, my daughters decided to drag it into my house anyway and forced me to deal with it and learn from it. But so at this point, I think, Melissa, you should talk about maybe a little bit about how you got involved in drug use and, you know, kind of your experience.
Okay, well, it started in elementary school. It was fine. Everything was fine. When I got to middle school, you know, everybody had their little cliques and stuff, and there was the white, rich, popular girls. There was the Hispanic girls, and there's the Asian cliques. And I didn't fit in with the white preppy girls. Like, I mean, my mom gave me everything I needed, but I wasn't up to date with all the fashion and name brand things. And, you know, we didn't have that type of money to splurge on stuff like that. But I just didn't fit in with them, and I didn't look like them. I looked more Mexican, but I didn't speak Spanish, so I didn't fit in with them either. I did have a couple really close Hispanic girlfriends of mine. And then I started, then I made friends with an Asian girl and then became a part of their group. It started all with just drinking, and it was just drinking, and then, you know, everybody was smoking pot, so we were all smoking pot. And then I started experimenting with cocaine, and that was just a fun party thing. It wasn't like a real big deal yet.
How old were you, Melissa?
I was, the drinking was around 12, and then 13, that's when I first tried cocaine. And then at that time, what was popular was the dance scene and ecstasy. So I got really heavily into ecstasy and going to underage clubs, but we would do drugs, and there was older people there too. So it was like a party rave type thing going on. So from the rave scene, me and my best friend at the time, we were just hanging out at her house, and her older brother, much older brother, was a meth user, and that's when we tried it for the first time. It was the funnest thing I've ever tried, and both of us were hooked immediately. We started using all the time. Before I hit 15, like, I was already a full-blown meth addict, a meth user every single day. And it took me away from the fun drinking type of crowd to the druggy type of crowd, which came, you know, there's a lot more dangerous people involved and stuff. So yeah, that's where it led down. And then my mom sent me away around that time to California for a month to try to get clean and sober. I came back. I continued to use. Around 18, I started dating somebody, and him and all his friends, he was Vietnamese, and him and all his friends were using heroin, and they were smoking it. It wasn't needles or anything, so I didn't think it was that bad. And when I tried it, it felt just like a Vicodin or a pain pill. So it wasn't that bad to me. I'm like, why do people think it's so bad when it doesn't feel that way? I found that out after a couple days, because I didn't know you get sick from it. I didn't know what opiates do to your body. Nobody warned me that you get sick from it. At first, in the beginning, it wasn't that bad because I wasn't an everyday user, but the more you felt sick after you use it, the more you want to do more, you know, you continue. Yeah, you continue to keep using it. And his friends were also smoking crack on foil and from pipes and stuff, and I started trying that. But then I found out I was pregnant. When I first found out I was pregnant, it was my first son, and I completely stopped everything, and it's something that I didn't want to do anymore. But my addiction is from so long ago. Having a baby didn't stop me. I stayed clean throughout my whole pregnancy, and after he was 4 months old, I started using again. I wanted to get away. I didn't want to use anymore. I wanted to be a good mom. So I left him and I took my son with me, and I moved to my mom's. We were still in a relationship, so I thought, but I didn't quit when I moved to my mom's. I was driving back to Portland every day to get more stuff. And my son's dad, we both had a conversation, and he was like, okay, I'm going to watch David while you go get clean, and you watch David while I go get clean. So I had him for 3 weeks while he went to go to treatment. When he got out of treatment, he was about 3 weeks clean, and I was supposed to go pick up my son for a visit, and he served me with court papers and took custody of him. Well, the court papers said I couldn't even see my son until a court date, and that was like a month away. That was one of the hardest times of my life. Someone telling you can't see your son. When he served me, I asked to hold my son, and I put him in my car and just drove away with him, and I went back to my mom's.
Yeah, I remember when you showed up with him in the car. She was hysterical at the time. She was in the house hysterical, and I called her ex-boyfriend, and he told me what was going on. Did you have papers with you? Did you show me papers?
I had the serving papers.
Yeah, I saw the papers. I read them, and I explained to Melissa that she was going to have to take David back. And we
actually called the police.
We did. We talked to the police,
and they came out.
Yep. And so we tried to figure out what was going on, but this was sort of sprung on her. And then we ended up driving David. I think you didn't go with me, did you?
I couldn't. Yeah,
I went and took David back to his dad's at that point.
But yeah, that was a really hard time, and my ex, he didn't disclose that he was a user to his lawyer, so I pretty much told them, hey, he uses too. He's only been clean for 3 weeks. We did hire a lawyer, and what we agreed upon was I was supposed to go to treatment, and we were supposed to come back to court in a year. I was signed over temporary custody, which I should have never done. I don't know why my lawyer insisted I do it, but I should have never did that. But having my son taken from me, it put me in such a horrible place of guilt and shame where I continue to use. I could not stop. Being away from your first child was really hard. It still is, because he never came back to live with me. Even though I'm really good friends with his dad now, and I forgive him. But he's still with him, and I feel like I messed up so bad because I couldn't quit using. And when I did, I asked if I could have my son back, and his dad, it wasn't even an option. He would fight me, and his family has money, and but my son was old enough for me to ask him what my son wanted, and my son said, I don't want to hurt my dad's feelings. So I left it alone. That's what he wanted. He's 13 now, and one thing, his dad is doing an amazing job with him, and I can see my son whenever I want. I can pick him up. I can do whatever I want with him. And his dad has never asked me for a penny in child support. I help when I can, and I do what I can.
And you have a great relationship with David. I mean, you guys have a good relationship. David he's a happy kid, and her ex allows us to have him as much as we want to. I have a relationship with David, and when he was really little, he was here all the time. Before my younger grandson needed more attention, and I had to get involved with that. But my oldest grandson, David, he has spent lots of time with us, and that must have been really hard for you.
It still is. I try not to think about it because I'm like, I still don't have one of my kids back. Like,
Right.
it's not a good feeling.
Right.
But I also don't want to hurt my son and put him through a custody. They might even let him live with me, but where I'm at, have 3 kids in my home, and you know, I can't afford to give him what he needs and what he's used to.
And that's okay. David is a happy kid, and you see him whenever, you know, you want, for the most part, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And I do too. I mean, your ex has never kept him from me. He almost did once. We'll probably get into that experience at some point. But yeah, I'm super proud of you, Melissa. You've come a long way. And, you know, it takes... As a mom, I can't imagine how it must feel to give in to not letting your child live with you. It takes a very strong person to do that. I'm very proud of you.
Yeah.
Because that's pretty amazing. You've taken your own selfishness out of the moment and allowed what's best for your son.
Yeah.
That's a mom.
Well, I brought it up before and it became a huge ordeal, and they didn't answer my phone calls for a week. So it scared me too, because I'm like, he has the power to take him, and my son has a passport. He can go to Vietnam whenever they want. So that was always a fear, that he would take him out of the country. But we're on really good terms now, and he's an amazing dad, and he's really strict, and I'm the lenient one. And he does a really good job with him, and my son has everything he needs. So,
That's super amazing.
yeah, so a little bit back to my story. I continued to use, and I became pregnant for a second time with my son, he's 9 now. And I could not quit using. And I used to think of these moms that would use while they were pregnant, how horrible they are, and how could you ever hurt a child like that? But when you're in your addiction, you just couldn't stop. And the thing was, I was pregnant, and I didn't want to tell anybody about my pregnancy because I was so ashamed of anybody knowing that I was using while pregnant. Towards the end, I knew I was running out of time, and I got into an inpatient rehab. I was 2 weeks clean in there, and I was 8 months pregnant. And I left to go to a court hearing, and I relapsed at that court hearing, and I went back to treatment. They let me stay knowing that I relapsed, and it kick-started labor for me. I gave birth to my son, and he had to be put on medication. That was another really hard time because I was trying to get sober, and you're watching your son go through withdrawal because of your bad decisions. It was another really hard thing. One of the hardest things I've done too. I took, the state did not take him because I was already an inpatient. I had a DHS case open, but it was only open for 3 months, and I stayed an inpatient. And after 3 months, I left with my son, and the day I left, I relapsed again. So I continued to use and be like a stay-at-home mom, but using. It's not like I was out partying or anything, but I was using with my son in the house on a daily basis. And that was just my life. And his dad worked swing shifts, so he wasn't there to monitor. His dad was not an addict. I mean, he smoked marijuana and he's experimented before, but he's not an addict like me anyways. After he was, when he was like 3 years old, I tried to get clean again, and I got on the Suboxone program. I tried my hardest. During the first week of doing the Suboxone program, I was still using, and my son got a hold of one of my strips. It was in my purse or something like that, and he got a hold of it. He thought it was candy or something, and he ingested a little bit of it. And I wasn't sure if he really did or not, but the way he was acting, I knew something was really wrong. And then I called the ambulance to the house and picked him up, and they're like, he's probably just tired, but I knew better. And so we went to the hospital, and I told him he probably ingested this. And because I was doing other drugs in the house, there was some type of smoke contact. So my son had amphetamines in his system. DHS was called, and my son was taken, not into state custody. Thankfully, my mom took my son for that time, but they took my son away from his father, which was fucking horrible because he didn't do anything to deserve any of that. He was a good man. He's a good man, and I was lying to him that I was even using. It wasn't his fault. And because marijuana was not legal at the time, they looked at that as a drug user. And so poor Rooney, I broke his heart, and I totally broke his heart.
Yes, we have some hard stories to tell.
Yeah.
But I was there, and I walked into the hospital. I got a call from my younger daughter, and I walked into the hospital knowing that my grandson had ingested something, but I wasn't sure at the time exactly what it was. So when I got there and I walk in, and Melissa's hysterical, and I'm in a fairly new relationship, and my boyfriend is with me, and the social worker is there, and Melissa had been told that they are taking custody because the state took custody first, asked questions later. The JJ, my grandson, was sedated at the time, and she looked at me, the social worker, and said, he'll either be going into state care or you can take him. And so within 2 minutes, I walk into a situation of where my grandson is sedated and had OD'd, and my daughter's hysterical, being told that custody was taken away from her, and I have 10 minutes to make a decision as to whether I'm going to take on this 3-year-old into a fairly new relationship that I had just moved in with my boyfriend at the time. And I work full time, and I had another grandson who I was also having to intervene and try to help with custody. So I literally, with my now husband, walked around the hallway, and I told him, I can't let my grandson go into foster care or to state custody. And so I am willing to move if I need to move, but I can't just let him go. And so my amazing husband, boyfriend at the time, said he was super angry, but he was not willing to lose me, and this wasn't my fault, and that I could do what I needed to do. So I ended up with 2 grandkids moving in, 3 and 4, within literally 5 days of each other because of what their moms were going through. It was a very painful moment, and Melissa's son at the time really had never been away from her, and he did not do well. He did not do well here, and had his cousin, who was just 6 months older than him, if he hadn't already been here, I don't know what would have happened. But her son JJ latched onto his cousin, and you know, he lived here with me for 3 months. It was seeing his dad on the weekends and Melissa a little bit. It was traumatic for everybody. It was heartbreaking. It was just a situation. These are the things that happen when you become addicted, and it doesn't just affect one person. It affects anyone that loves the addict.
Yeah. I was really proud of JJ's dad, Rooney, because he wasn't an addict and he just smoked marijuana. It was easy for him to quit, and he did everything that DHS wanted. And he went to groups before work, I swear, like 4 days a week. He worked his ass off to get JJ back home with him.
He did. Matter of fact, when we went to the hearing, all of us were at the hearing. I think it was 3 months later, 3.5 months later, that he'd been living with me. And DHS was there, and then, you know, there was another lawyer person there. And they said this is the fastest anyone has ever gotten custody back under these circumstances. That's how hard he worked.
He wasn't an addict. They should have never removed him in the first place from him. It's one thing, it's really hard for me to deal with that they had to do that. And because me and Rooney were still together, we never broke up. I had to leave the home so my son could come back with him. And Rooney didn't have a car at the time. It was my car, but that was for him to get to work and to take care of my son. And so I left the home, and that's when I became basically homeless and couch surfing and staying with friends and family. And I was so far in my addiction and so overcome with guilt. You would think that something like that would wake you up, but it didn't. It put me going the opposite way of I'm a fucking piece of shit. And I tried to kill myself after that happened. I don't think I've only told a couple people that, but that's where my state of my mind was. And it took me forever to engage and do what I needed to do to get my son back.
What do you think was the turning point? What do you think actually
Helped.
made you do what you needed to do?
Well, I tried regular inpatients, and it was very hard. Being a heroin addict, you are in full withdrawal. So I decided to go down a different route, methadone. I got on methadone, and it was about a year and a half into my case. My son's already been placed with his father for a long time, but I'm still out using and doing all this. So I got on methadone, and it completely changed my life. It saved me. And I got my rights back. They never terminated my rights, because they could have done that and said father has custody and mom's out of the picture. And then that last court hearing where they closed my case, it was probably the most happiest I've ever been, and everybody was so proud.
You worked so hard. I remember that.
Yeah.
I think one of the hardest things that during that time, Melissa had this little apartment, and we started to try to rebuild our relationship. And at that time, I was in my own counseling. Just the guilt of all that was happening to my kids was about a killer for me. So I knew I needed to be mentally healthy if I was ever going to help my kids. So I was going to counseling, and Melissa and I started, she had me over for dinner for the first time in her apartment. And we didn't almost know what to talk about, because we didn't.
Weird.
Our relationship was based around me trying to keep her from using drugs. It was really
chaos,
that simple.
Basically chaos.
And so when we finally sat down and looked at each other, and we're like, so who are you?
Yeah.
We didn't have a clue about each other, really about each other. I knew what kind of drugs she liked to do, and that was, and, she knew what I cuss and try to get her to stop. But as far as having a healthy relationship, I would sit in my counselor's office and bawl. I don't know what to say to her. I don't know what to talk about. And, she'd give me ideas. And so we started cooking together. That was really the first time that we found something we liked to do. So then once a week, we agreed once a week I'd come over after work, and she would make a dinner for me, and we would talk about, cooking and whatever, and just slowly try to rebuild that relationship. And eventually I got her to move back over to Vancouver. But it wasn't the end. There was still a lot of relapses before we get to where we are today.
Yeah, two relapses from then until now. So after my case closed, it didn't stop there. I had one minor relapse after that, and then I got back on methadone, and then I had that was my last relapse after that. And I think a couple years after my son came back to live with, after I came back to live with my son and his dad, that's when my nephew came to live with me.
Yeah. One of the things you don't really realize as a parent, when you are dealing with someone that has the kind of drug addiction we're talking about, you bury your kids in your head over and over so many times. I had to do that because I knew at some point she was going to die if things didn't change. And to be able to survive that and be there for the other kids and my grandkids, it's something you're trying to mentally prepare yourself, because it's not natural. It's not natural to watch your child die. And I was watching her disappear in front of me. At one point, she was down to about 70 pounds. And I could see that she wasn't going to make it. She spent 2 months at one point in the hospital. They wouldn't let her leave because they had a stent in her heart because of infections. And so this road has been traumatic. I've buried her in my mind many, many times. And even when she got on the path of being clean, I didn't believe it in my head. I constantly was like, if I called her and she didn't pick up the phone, I knew she was using. And so
She's
I
a
would have these-
psycho. Today she's still a psycho.
Whatever. I would have these
I have to
anxiety
fucking
attacks.
answer her after 10 minutes or she freaks
knows
the fuck out.
I would be hysterical. I'd be driving around looking for I know I go psychotic. And so but Melissa had to get to the point that she understood the anxiety that it would drive and how scared and terrified I was about anything happening. And so, you know, today with her being clean for the 3 years that she's been clean, and her and I working on our relationship the way we have, and just, you know, forgiving each other for our mistakes, I think, and just the fact that I would die for my daughter. There's nothing I wouldn't do. I love her that much. I think we've been able to get to a place now that we can be friends. She still gets mad at me. I can be overbearing. I admit it. I'm an overbearing mother, and that's just the fucking way it is. But with that said, I would die for my child. I would do anything for her and my grandkids. And I think today we forgive, we move on, we try to continue to better ourselves. And at the end of the day, we know that no matter what, we love each other. And that's really what gets me through.
Yeah.
And I'm really proud of you.
Thank you.